Hello, I'm Alan Miller. This is the Together Talks podcast. Today, I'm really pleased to have Dr. Clare Craig here to talk to. Claire, you're a consultant pathologist, as well as being a founder of HART and a commentator in the press and the public generally about much of what we've seen in the last 2 years. I like to ask silly questions because I often find it difficult to follow some of these things. But what exactly is a pathologist, just to begin with? And welcome to Together Talks podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I mean, a pathologist, I think a lot of people connect with postmortems, and we are the people that do postmortems, but we're fully qualified doctors, and we're the people who do the diagnostic. So we're in the labs, we're looking at samples, and we're trying to figure out what's going on for the patient on behalf of the doctors looking after them. So, my expertise is in testing and diagnostics, which is how I got interested in the whole COVID thing.
And how did you get, when you got interested in it, just let's remind ourselves, because these last couple of years have been so very long and so much has happened. But just what were you doing just prior to March 2020?
So I was working hard for a startup doing cancer diagnostics at the time. And I have 4 children, so I was busy with them as well. And, we were just sort of the usual frantic family life. And I was reading the news the way everyone else was. And I bought into the whole narrative. I was worried at the beginning. I worried for, my immediate family initially. And then as the data came out, more worried for my parents as we realised it was much more the old that were going to be affected. And really, I remained kind of in that state of anxiety, watching the press releases with, watching the daily death count, all of that sort of hyped up response I was absolutely bought into. Until the summer of 2020 came along, and we had this situation where there was a very steady trickle every day of cases and deaths, apparent cases and deaths, which was such a constant feature. There was no more wave. It was just a constant similar number every day. Then it made me curious about whether or not this was a testing error, because that's what we see in diagnostics, that there are, tests aren't perfect. And when they go wrong, you'll get a very low percentage of tests that will just carry on going wrong. So I kind of dug into that to see if we could investigate whether the people who were still being called COVID at that time had the same characteristics as the people who'd had it in the spring. And when you dug into it, it wasn't the same. It had much lower mortality. They were more representative of the patients that would just be coming through the hospital door. So there was a much more even male-female split, whereas in the spring, it killed more men. And there were, in the spring, we had a disproportionate number of people who were black on ICU, and in the summer, that relationship had gone as well. So I, in my utter naivety, thought, right, I've got a responsibility here to kind of highlight that there's an issue that needs to be fixed. And I thought that it would be fixed and that would be it. So I put my head above the parapet to say this. And of course, that wasn't the reaction that I got.
And what was the reaction? Just to remind ourselves, what was the reaction that you got when you did that? So
there were 2 types of reaction. On the one hand, on the one hand, I was ignored, obviously, because I'm just one person. And I was attacked to a degree at that point for saying that on the basis that the authorities couldn't possibly get anything wrong. But I also was introduced to all sorts of people from all sorts of different areas of expertise who also had concerns in their area. And now, obviously, when you're kind of bombarded with all of that, it's quite overwhelming because, given that this is not my area of expertise, to understand whether someone else's concern is genuine or not takes work. You have to kind of do your reading to sort of really understand where they're coming from and whether or not they're genuine. So I did a lot of reading. And it probably took me about 6 months of hard work to feel like I'd got a good grasp on the full breadth of the topic. And came up for air thinking, this is a bit frightening, because how do we get everyone else to do that work? That's a huge amount of reading to really get a grip on it. Where we are now, I'm much less intimidated by that because the story has evolved. We've got, we're in a position to be able to teach people about it in a simpler, easier way. But also there are certain things that have happened along the way where it's exposed itself. That things like the story around not being able to transmit after vaccination. Everybody knows that's not true just from looking around them. Like common sense tells you that's not true. So there are certain aspects of the narrative, the official narrative, that have crumbled just simply because they were unsustainable, because they were not true. And so some of the work's been done for us along the way.
So, let's just go through it step by step because there's a lot, right? On the one hand, we had a pandemic strategy up until the most recent experience, and that was jettisoned, right? It was all of the kind of ways of doing things were done, and we had this measure of lockdown imposed. Just what's your take on that bit? Why do you think that happened? Have you got a clear idea about that? How do we get to that situation?
There was a point in March 2020 when they were sort of following the pandemic plan. Not with huge confidence, but we were sort of in that direction. And then there was this U-turn to follow what everyone else had done around the world. And I think one of the problems that someone highlighted to me about that pandemic plan, so the plan was that people should use tissues. Like the main crux of that plan was catch it, bin it, kill it around using tissues. And, staying at home if you're ill. But otherwise, there was an acknowledgement that there was very little you can do about an airborne respiratory virus. And within the plan also, there was, this was discussing a situation with influenza where there'd be 375,000 deaths. Now, one of the issues with the plan is that it wasn't communicated to the public in the cold light of day, right, when emotions weren't raised. And so the public had never been informed that this was what would happen should there be a pandemic and 375,000 deaths. So there was this disengagement. So then, and it should have been anticipated that, of course, the public would be scared, right? And they would want to do something. That was the other awful, awful thing, was this desire to do something, regardless of the evidence for doing it and regardless of how effective it might be, so that people felt they had done their bit. And so suddenly we're in a kind of down a pathway of politicians searching around for something to do.
Well, just to break it down a bit more as well, there were a number of things, weren't there, as you say, going on. On the one hand, it does seem striking that policy makers and decision makers seem to outsource a lot of responsibility to doctors and scientists. So, and we had all these terms like follow the science, and so as though somehow the science is a thing that's established and understood and isn't susceptible to criticism or change or interpretation. And even if all those things stand, then policy is something different. It's what you do about that. So on the one hand, that was going on, but also there were voices, as you say, there were some very shrill voices that were attacking the government and saying, you guys are all COVID idiots, this is stupid, you're not. So that desire to be seen to be doing something was also in the context of some political challenge to say, what are you doing? This is gonna result in death and killing people. And in a way, a lot of people sort of say, well, these leaders, they're so powerful and they're authoritarian. But in a way, it struck me that they're quite weak, right? So this thing is that there was a situation where it had been established, the pandemic strategy, but there was a caving in. This U-turn, we saw a few U-turns actually, but this caving in, right? So it more reflected a sort of weakness, surely, no?
I think you're probably right there. And I think the scientists had this perverse incentive that, if they exaggerated the problem, they've covered themselves because they've sounded the alarm. The politicians are stupid stuff, but that's their fault. Whereas if they underestimated the extent of the problem, they are in the firing line for being criticised. And so while those shrill voices were getting louder, the scientists themselves were hearing them and thinking, well, I better cover ourselves here a bit and let's ramp it up. And it must have been, the thing is that the SAGE, even at that time, was an enormous number of people, but obviously the people that actually had the ear of the politicians would have been much smaller, and they would have sounded like one voice. And so that becomes quite hard for the politicians to go against, especially when none of them have got a science degree. Like none of them, the people in power have. Yeah. And so what could have happened in a kind of ideal scenario is that they would have sought out other voices at that point to sort of challenge the scientists, realizing that they weren't in a position to. But that would have been really hard at that point, because it wasn't obvious where you would turn to find those people, because people were readily opposing it loudly in the public forum.
Well, so on this point, I mean, there were some people, I mean, I believe Sunetra Gupta and Carl Hennigan, there were some people that were involved with SAGE and were consulted, but like you say, they weren't necessarily the voice that really loud. But also within this, because people talk about scientists as though a scientist in and of themselves has the answer to all of these things, rather than being a method of research in a particular area of investigation. And it's not to be a Luddite about this or a Philistine, because it's very important to have experts and to draw, but then there's policy decisions based on that. But within all of this, there was modelling, wasn't there, as well? It wasn't just that some scientists had said some things. There were a lot of the assumptions about what could happen was down to modelling and models from people like Neil Ferguson and Imperial College versus other models at other universities, Oxford and elsewhere, that had a different approach. And that kind of sense of caution and fear and risk. I know we've talked, there's been a lot of discussion, Laura Dodsworth's book, A State of Fear, about how fear was used. But I also think there's a sense in which, just even the leaders themselves, this sense of risk and fear and concern, like you were saying, they're getting presented with these arguments and these ideas and makes them even nervous about it. But so there's an element of that, right, as well?
Yeah, and so the modelling itself is, it's almost laundering a fiction into science. So you take your assumptions and you do the maths, you produce beautiful graphs, beautiful. They're far more beautiful than actual scientific graphs, which never go quite the way you hoped they would. And then you present it as a scientific paper, as if it's fact. And it's not. It's your best guess based on your assumptions. And in reality, there are two assumptions that were critical at that point. One is, what percentage of the population are going to catch this thing? And the other is, what percentage of them are going to die? Now, that's it. And when you bring it down to those 2 points, that becomes something the politicians can actually try and get their head around and debate and realise, where the boundaries are of the guessing and actually have a sort of ordinary conversation. But because it's presented as very complicated graphs, they didn't get to understand it at the level that they ought to have been able to do. And the one thing I'd say about science is that science and debate and democracy, all of these things are the way our culture corrects mistakes, right? None of us are omniscient. We don't get everything right all of the time. None of us do. It's very odd living in this world where people are pretending that they do, but they won't be right all of the time. And so when you accept that, you have to have systems in place to correct the mistakes. So one of them is to have hear what all the voices are saying, because then you get the sort of breadth of human understanding. And then you can kind of, see that there are some things that might be more uncertain than others and get a feel for where the uncertainty lies. And then in science, you get to test ideas and see which ones work and which ones don't work, which is what science is. Science is not a religion to be followed. Science is a way of finding out where we're wrong.
So that brings up a lot of questions about just free speech and open debate and the discussion about science as though it's a holy grail or a faith or a religious evangelical thing, or is it, as every transformation in science has been, whether it's about Newton or Copernicus or anything, it's been about that engagement, criticism, throwing it up, and often very controversial and very offensive to many people, actually. And we saw a lot of that, didn't we? We saw a lot of this kind of sense of people were irresponsible if you asked questions or threw things up. It was almost like it was suggested that if you're putting questions up or throwing an alternative view up, that you are risking lives. It was a very, it's not so long ago, but it's almost seems like even though we've just come through it, it seems like such a crazy time we've just been through. But the idea that you're putting all different alternatives forward, the accusation was made that you're risking lives and you're being irresponsible. To me, that sounds irresponsible, right? It's an irresponsible way of approaching it, surely.
It absolutely is. But there's something quite frightening about how humans deal with being wrong themselves. We don't like being wrong. We get defensive. But worse than that, when someone is showing us that we're wrong, we, first of all, stick our fingers in our ears and say, I don't want to hear that, because it's difficult for me to process. But the feelings that people have about people showing them they're wrong are like disgust, and they become powerful emotions that can turn very quickly to violence. People have studied this, and that type of interaction is actually really, really frightening. And I mean, we're in a country and in a culture which for a long, long time has held that we wouldn't have blasphemy laws. And, we have laws that kind of touch on it, but we don't have, you say that against my religion and you're banged up in jail. And yet we have had serious people suggest that anyone that says things that are sort of anti-vax, it was mainly aimed at, but who knows where it would go to, would get a jail sentence. So we've now got not only a new religion, but we've got this concept of blasphemy around it. Now, if that's really frightening, and obviously that's not an environment where you can have open debate. It's not an environment where people who've got concerns feel readily able to raise those concerns. And without that, we won't progress at all. But I think realistically, we will be living for the rest of our lives in a community that's divided on this, because people are, there'll be a core group of people who change their mind, and I'm one of them. I've changed my mind over this, and other people will. But there will be some people who won't. And so, we have to kind of figure out how to handle that.
And in a democracy, there's often people who disagree about all sorts of things. It's about a majority, and there's always differing views. But your points are well taken. I mean, what's the story behind HART, and what is the role of it, and your role within it, and what's the goal with it, and what it's doing?
So HART was set up at the end of 2020. Prior to that, I was speaking out, and other people were, questioning what was going on in public and being attacked as being outliers or lone wolves, or, it was quite easy to take one person down. And so we came together as a body of scientists, doctors, other professionals. We've got all sorts of other expertise in there to speak as a group so that we wouldn't be taken down so easily. And it's been such a positive experience. So I'm co-chair along with Jonathan Engler, and we have a group of amazing people, some of whom you can see on our website, but a lot of whom haven't been brave enough to put their faces out there and say, this is me. But they're there with us, and they're there helping and educating us. And so between us, we challenge each other, and we make sure we're sort of up to date on all of it, and support each other. And it's they're a great bunch of people.
I mean, we heard this term all the time. It's only recently. You laugh when you look back on it, but you're not a virologist, you're not an epidemiologist, and this whole idea that if you didn't study a very particular thing, you should not have a view about what policy happens or what we do with society, as though somehow an epidemiologist would know what all of the risks and balances, the costs and benefits are of doing all sorts of things versus just a very particular thing. And wasn't that part of the issue, right? The idea was that things were weighed up just in the context of what would COVID mean, the control or suppression of a particular infection, and rather than all of the other aspects in society, everything from other health conditions to family and education and freedom. I mean, all of those things. Surely that was the problem, was it not?
Absolutely. And I think realistically, nobody can get a handle on the whole subject of COVID without being very, very multidisciplinary about it. There is so many aspects that you need to understand to be able to really get a grip. And science has changed for the worse over the last few decades, whereby in the past, there were polymaths. Think of the really sort of famous scientists from the past who did amazing things. They were very often polymaths who were great at tons of different things and pulled what they learnt from one area of expertise across to another, and had amazing breakthroughs that were real stepwise changes. Whereas more recently, if you want to do science, the way you do it is you find some little niche that's very specific that you know you're going to get results in because you're sort of just digging deeper into that one area, and whatever you find is going to be publishable. But it's just very, very niche, small thing. And then there's becomes a sort of culture where you're not allowed to step out of your furrow. And that's your bit. And you're not allowed to even ask questions about what's going on elsewhere, because that's disrespectful to the people you're asking the questions of, because that's their area of expertise. You should take it on trust. And, what we really need is for scientists to be able to step out of their furrows and do things that cross-link across specialties, because that's where change can happen. And while we're always just picking at tiny little details, we're not actually making very much progress. And we're spending huge amounts of money on science research that hasn't actually made any groundbreaking differences. There have been improvements, but I think we could have perhaps been a lot more efficient about making them.
I mean, I think what you're also talking about is the political realm as it happens. I mean, there are great examples, as you say, in like what used to call Renaissance person, or more recently, people that were in engineering and literature and the arts and science and endeavours. But actually, the idea that ordinary people can have a view on policy as well. That whole great idea of democracy, one person, one vote, and everyone gets a say, even if you're not educated, because the idea of what we do isn't predicated on having a PhD on political economy, right? It's based on a number of different things, right? And that's what the spirit of freedom and democracy is about. And I felt there was a really, it's presented when some of this was going on as though it was really enlightened, but actually it was really anti-democratic and anti-people in many ways. It just came, some of that stuff. And I'm wondering how you feel about this kind of moment, because in America, the culture wars has become very divisive, but it's also true that we've seen some of this here. And I want to go on to some key things that happen, but just in terms of your overview of where we are now, you were sounding a bit more positive. You could say things and everything, but I still think there's a lot of people who haven't really followed what's happened and aren't really clear about what's happened. And we might have come out of the situation, but I don't know if we're entirely clear. And also if new things come along, to what extent do you think that kind of just engaging people or people being involved and people having their voice is an important point? Not just scientists, but just generally ordinary people, the public and others.
Oh, no, I think that's incredibly important. But I can kind of see how we got here a little bit, which is that the theory around epidemics is that you have exponential growth at the beginning. And so although it may look to an untrained eye like not much is going on, if you can slow it down by doing something, you need to do it before it looks like much has happened. Otherwise, it's got away and it's too late to kind of bring it back in. And so we're kind of taught as doctors, you understand this stuff, but they're not going to understand that. And so it becomes, very from the outset, it's very quite patronising. But I think we've had an issue for some time now where politicians and the government have spoken down to people and patronised people to an extreme degree. And we're seeing it now more than ever, where actually we have a public that is really quite educated on COVID. They've been reading about it for a long time. And we've still got the Department for Health today putting out an advert in rainbow colours saying, get boosted, get boosted, get boosted, get boosted. Like, is that really the nuance we have here, right? People have got concerns about this stuff. And I feel like I've done more to address misplaced concerns around the vaccine than the Department for Health has done, because they don't want to engage with the people as if they have a brain. And I find that really, really depressing, because people aren't stupid. They are capable of understanding complexity, and we should engage people with a bit of respect.
So, why do you think that is then?
What that they do that?
Yeah.
I think they think people are stupid. I genuinely think that they believe the vast majority of the public not to be capable of, making a sensible decision. And they also seem to believe that shouting "get boosted" at them will do something.
Although, let's go back and see what's happened, because it's not, is it just stupidity? And is it that, because I think that in a way, it's also about I know for myself, when all of the conversations about statistics and science, I mean, I'm dreadful at all of those things, right? And it's very difficult to have a conversation about those specific things. And people, it's a bit like when the environmental discussion and everyone's quoting stats to try and win an argument, and you never really win an argument like that. I mean, sometimes you do if it's very clear, but a lot of people are like, well, because it was a lot to everyone was saying the science and all, it become very difficult on that issue. And as you say, almost everyone's made mistakes. Everyone's made mistakes, but the question of how you engage and address it. So the question is if they think people are stupid. There's also the case that there's been a lot of fear and propaganda and driving things. So even if it's not stupidity, maybe there's a sense that there's a kind of repeat muscle there, that, you know, you've got that situation that people are understood things in a certain way, and this is a continuation of it, right? I mean, maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, maybe it is. And I mean, it's quite frightening how scared people think and behave, and you know what seeing it all firsthand and living through it all firsthand, and me being one of them at one point, you realise how destructive fear is as an emotion, and how all-encompassing it is, how it has that addictive quality that you almost go back to find the next kick. You know, you're going back to see what the deaths are today to get it's horrible. And that's where the public have been, you know, they were put through that very deliberately. And yeah, there is an issue about getting people out of it. And I mean, I am no psychologist, but I have thought about this. And the way that I kind of looked at the effect of fear is that we've all been in love, right? We've all been infatuated with someone. And that has quite a lot of overlap, that you sort of get obsessive, you sort of have intrusive thoughts, and you have that addictive quality then as well. And it takes about 4 years to wear off. And some of the experience with fear in terms of things like, you know, things where the whole population have been captured, like the Salem witch trials, or with Nazism, or I shouldn't bring that up, but, you know, those sort of big events in history where you've got an emotional public take about 4 years to wear off. So I'm not sure we're necessarily that far through it, but it is clearly wearing off for some people. And it's just a question of getting to the critical mass before it wears off for everybody. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that people, there was a big discussion about was when we were looking at the situation, there was a discussion about cases versus, and you were saying the two key things about severe illnesses and deaths. There was also a lot of things have been parlayed into resources. Well, what's it going to mean for the NHS? So it's not just about deaths. What would our limit be and what we're prepared to put up with? But also there's a question of how resources brought into that. But the question of how tests were used, because that's not gone away, right? Now we've got a situation where there's a look at more investment in some new PCR and testing, and dare I say it, there's a discussion about other things like monkeypox and virus X, and there are certainly going to be things in the future, whenever that is, who knows. But the question of testing positive for something versus someone who's really ill or going to die, and what that means. Now, some people are saying, like, you know, millions have got it in Britain right now. Should we take some more measures? Just how do you see that situation with what's happened with testing and where we are now?
So I think at the beginning, the attempts to get a new test off the ground and up and running and at volume were quite impressive. And you know, we got testing into the hospitals where it was needed, at a number that meant it was actually working quite well by April. And if you were seriously ill, you could figure it out. And the numbers of tests that were coming back negative show you that there were enough tests to go round so that when you weren't that sure whether or not they had it, you could still get a test done. So, you know, at the beginning it worked well. And the only thing is, I would have kept it like that. So with SARS-1 and with, you know, other situations like this, testing is done in the healthcare system to figure out about what's going on with sick people. Now, testing was brought out of that system and you know, done at a community level, with the belief that doing that would be something that meant you could slow the spread of infection. And hypothetically, in certain circumstances, that might have been the case. So if you look at, say, gastroenteritis infections with lockdown, they plummeted, not to zero, to about half what they normally were, and they came back up as mobility increased. So there are some infectious diseases where reducing contact makes a difference, but this doesn't seem to be one of them, right? And so what they did was just they decided, right, testing's the answer, test, and we're going to throw huge amounts of money at this, get everybody behind it, and it sort of seemed logical. The public sort of could see the logic of it and were prepared to do it. But they never engaged anybody who was a testing expert. So we have a committee who do all of the mass screening testing that we have in the country for cancer. We have a committee of people whose expertise it is to get that right, who were never consulted about mass testing for this. And that expertise is all around when the testing can go wrong. And, obviously testing can go wrong, and they weren't being consulted about how to minimise that risk.
Why do you think they weren't?
I really don't know. And that's, there are some questions I really don't have an answer to. And that makes no sense. They should have been consulted. That's what their job is. They are there to advise the government on this stuff, and they weren't asked. And so what happens when you mass test is that because testing errors happen as a percentage of tests done, you'll get more and more errors being a problem. And that's much more of an issue when you're between waves. When you're between waves, we have serious issues with test results being wrong. During a wave, the testing's been okay in that the numbers of people who end up with antibodies are kind of about the same as the number who test positive on the testing program, the government testing program. So if people are coming forward with symptoms, getting tested, being positive, most of them will get antibodies. They had it, right? So it kind of works when you've got a lot of disease around. But when there's not much disease around, it's something that doesn't work. And when you're testing people who aren't sick, it doesn't work. So we've got situations where in the care homes, the staff and the residents are being tested incessantly for a long, long time, and you'll get a positive, and that sets you down a path of yet more testing, and then and being labelled as having an outbreak and all of the rest of it. And yet, so you end up with these outbreaks where nobody was actually ill. There have been people, there remember in the winter of 2020-21, a news item about an outbreak in a wedding where not one single person was sick. They just all tested and they got some positivity. This is not an outbreak of a disease. That's not what an outbreak of a disease is. And so when you're testing hospital staff and not let them come to work, and care home staff and not let them go to work, it has serious impacts. Also school children, not letting them go to school, it has serious impacts on society. And what we've seen with care home testing is, despite all of this testing, if you look at the trajectory of respiratory outbreaks in care homes across the country, there was a big spike in spring 2020, and a similar spike in the winter of 2021, and then a similar spike with each wave. We've done nothing. The spikes are the same height, the same width, the same number of people are being affected by infections, despite all of this testing. So then you think, well, okay, if we can't prevent anything with testing, we can just diagnose it. Then you would wind it all back in and say, look, we want to know when there's an outbreak. If someone's sick, we'll test them then.
So the thing is, a lot of this is all predicated on how damaging one would think that people getting infected with something is, right? So as you say at the start, the big concern, and I was one of those people, particularly with my mum who's got a condition, I'd go there with gloves and a mask, and we'd be washing the bags and and you think like everyone's very nervous, right? You think, what is this? Is like Ebola or whatever? And obviously Ebola isn't great at transmitting because it kills everyone straight away, right? So it's a different type of thing. But I've got a friend who used to say they must know. I mean, there's so many smart people. You trying to tell me they just don't know this from this stuff? What is going on? As we were going down the road, right, and it's becoming more and more clear. And as you're saying, that on the one hand, we've been told, even with a jab or anything, take this, and then you've got vaccine passports to check that people haven't got it, but it doesn't stop it transmitting, and you don't stop you catching it, but surely they must know. There's lots of bright people. They've got a lot of the smart people. What do you think, right, without getting you into it, but what do you think has happened in terms of, I get the point you're saying about when people think they were wrong, they get defensive and everything, but these are people that are running the country, whatever, they're taking advice. Surely they've got lots of they knew that there was a vulnerable group, an elderly group. They can see that things are changing, as that's what evidence is presenting. And yet we're getting into a situation where we were told we wouldn't vaccinate any children, and it was 15 million jabs to freedom. And now we're also looking at vaccinating 6-month-olds. What's happened with the people that are running things, in your opinion, to allow this to all happen?
I think there is this issue of adopting a belief, right? Once you've got a group of people in a hierarchy, particularly, who have adopted a belief that's wrong, trying to call it out is really difficult. This is one belief I'm talking about. So let's take what you were talking about, the sort of idea of spreading it before you're sick. So there was concern that this would be a problem right from the beginning. Any evidence that suggested it might be a problem was amplified massively. And one of the main papers that were talked about spread before being sick was it was a German paper, and it was about a Chinese woman who'd come over for a meeting in Germany, and a group of people she'd had a meeting with got sick. And they wrote this paper up about asymptomatic transmission, got it into the New England Journal of Medicine. It's not yet being retracted, but a journalist tracked down the Chinese woman who was the person who spread it, who had been dosed up to the nines on drugs because she was feverish and had been suppressing a cough the whole way through the meeting, and she was really unwell, but nobody thought to ask her. They just decided that was asymptomatic transmission, and that paper still is there being quoted and as an important part of the literature. And one of the real problems with the asymptomatic or the pre-symptomatic spread story is that the way that scientists have always presented viral measurements is on a logarithmic scale, which just screws with human thinking. It just doesn't work. That's not how we logically take things in. And so when you actually take it off the logarithmic scale and look at it on a linear scale, it's chugging along with really nothing much going on. Then you get symptoms and it hits the roof, and then it comes down again very sharply and then chugs away. But on a logarithmic scale, it looks like there's something quite important happening before that huge spike. But in reality, it's not that important. And when people have tried to measure how much of a contribution to an overall outbreak pre-symptomatic spread is, they come up with figures of around 6-7%. So, the bulk of the problem is that sick people produce a load of virus, and it goes into the air, and the air doesn't stay still. And we breathe air. And so, the idea that you can run away from breathing the air just doesn't work, and yet we're still in a mindset of talking about it as if it does. So I think that was one of the beliefs, and I can completely see how it wouldn't get challenged, and how, I think we've all worked in hierarchical environments where it's difficult to challenge what everybody around you believes in. But that was only one of several beliefs that formed this, this whole almost cultish system that needs taking down. And it starts off in the very beginning of, there's a serious risk of death to people who are young and healthy. And that's just not true. None of the evidence backs that up, but we've been running around for 2 years as if that is the case. And people who are making these important decisions and people who are, should know better, aren't even questioning that. They're just acting as if their lives are permanently at risk. So
on this, so they do admit that, right? So the CMO and others will say, right, they'll say, yeah, there's a higher risk, but then there'll be contingency points, right? They'll make them contingent. So they'll say, but the impact on spreading, we want to limit it. It's almost like you go back to the argument to reinforce the thing they want to do, even though they recognize there's highly vulnerable groups, right? Or the idea is, in order to protect those vulnerable groups, you've got to do these other things because otherwise it will impact them. We've seen with HART, you guys have come out and spoken, and as you said earlier, it's not. I don't think it's just bravery. I mean, people get cancelled and they get smeared, and they lose their livelihood. We've seen it in a range of areas. So you do need courage, but it's also, you have to make pragmatic decisions about how much you can put yourself above it. We saw the Great Barrington Declaration, right? I mean, there were lots of tens of thousands of doctors and scientists signed it, hundreds of thousands of citizens, and with HART. So there are alternative views, and it's not like the government and the CMO and others have not recognised that there's a distinct group. Yet when it comes to actually then saying, right, this is what we do. It's the decisions about what we do about it that is where the issue. Do you just think it's that they've gone so far down a road with a certain outlet that they now, in order to change that, it would look like everything else was wrong and they're scared of that? Or what do you think?
I think they're terrified of that. I mean, honestly, the arguments that they have been working with, they're just not defensible anymore. And when they come down, they are going to come crashing down. And obviously, they're going to do everything to keep sticking plasters over it, to keep it going for as long as they can. So, I mean, one of the key beliefs that we've had throughout this is that everybody's susceptible and that it's going to keep going out and getting people unless we change behaviour, right? But, we've had enough time now across the world to see how this thing works. And with every wave, it'll go up in a frightening way and it will peak. It will peak no matter what we are doing. It peaks because not everybody is susceptible to that particular variant. It will spread through the population until it's got everyone who is susceptible, peak, and then fall away. And we've seen that again and again and again right across the world with every single different variant. What we have seen, which is a bit confusing, is because we're measuring cases, it looks like each wave's got worse and worse and worse. But if you take a step back and say, hang on a minute, we've never measured diseases like this before. We would have measured it with hospitalisations. And you look at the hospitalisation curve. I mean, in the UK, it looks a little bit different to us around the world, but everywhere else in the world, you can see a very, very clear seasonal pattern. So you've got the first one, then it goes away in the summer, and then you've got, in Europe, a kind of low-grade autumn and spring, and a big peak in the winter. And we've seen that now for 2 years. And I mean, we're going to, in a few months' time, start to see it again. And if it's not with COVID, it'll be with some other respiratory virus, because this is what respiratory viruses do. And what we're seeing with those waves is that there is a new susceptible population that is a fraction of the population who will get that variant. And they can hide from it, but not forever, because they're susceptible to it. So that variant's going to find them. And we've had Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California, who has been, a fervent COVID fanatic. He let slip that he thinks it's a seasonal virus at one point. And then, that's all sort of been shut down and people have gone back to this pretend it's going to keep on going and keep on spreading unless we do something. But that seasonal element is just undeniable. I mean, it's been undeniable for a long time. And it's going to be interesting to see how they handle that, because it's an admission that actually none of what we did affected this trajectory. You can see it year on year. It is the same. The hospitalizations are the same. And so then their world crumbles. And then what do? So they have to keep denying the seasonality and looking more and more foolish.
Well, you mentioned Gavin Newsom, and you can see California versus Florida. We can see some of the things in Sweden versus what were done in other parts of Europe and what we did. And the zero COVID approach to Jacinda Ardern and New Zealand and what that's meant for New Zealand and Australia. And I do think people are looking at that a bit more. I'm not sure that the majority of the population necessarily have understood that. And I think there has been a gap, hasn't there, between, it's almost like not train spotters, but people who are really following this daily and engaged, and on both sides of the views, right, as it happens, that are very engaged. And then there's not been enough public debate and discussion and getting the public involved. I mean, there hasn't been enough parliamentary scrutiny either, and discussion and robust debate. It's been more like, here are the announcements, go and get on with it. It's kind of like that almost contemptuous view, disdainful. It's like, this is what it is, that the clever people have come up with it, keep everyone safe. I mean, it's not to be cynical about everything, because I do think it's really important that we have a very strong public health position, right, with infections and things like that. It's really crucial. But there's a deficit in terms of the public being engaged in this conversation and discussion. And that's got to be a challenge for us.
I think so, but I think there are elements of it that are becoming easier and easier to explain. So, for example, there was always the sort of issue around Southeast Asia, right? So what's going on there is, and obviously the mainstream media are pushing this idea that they behaved better than we did, and that's why they were blessed. But that was never the case, and people put forward very compelling evidence that this was just an issue of different aspects of immunity and what people had seen before. But there was definitely a geographical thing going on there. Southeast Asia, Australia and New Zealand were exempt up until recently. But what we've seen just now with their first proper COVID waves is that the mortality from those waves is of the same order as we saw in Europe in the first wave in spring 2020. So that shoots a lot of things out of the water. So, this Omicron variant that has not been as much of a problem for us here this time round was killing people in Southeast Asia at a high rate. And these are vaccinated people. So some of the stories we've been told about vaccination don't fit with that story. And some of the stories we've been told about Omicron don't either. Because, we've been told that the reason we had a quiet time is because of Omicron, but actually it could be that there's been prior exposure has primed people's immunity a bit to protect them, but it also could be that it wasn't quite as straightforward as we've been told around why people were dying, and that some of the deaths that have been labelled as COVID deaths from winter 20 to 21 weren't due directly to COVID. So we know that in winter 2020-2021, there was this wave of increase in COVID deaths, but a whole proportion of this big whack of them, about a third of them, were people who would have otherwise died of other causes. And we knew that because people weren't dying of the other causes in a sort of mirror image pattern, so that when the wave died away, they started dying of other causes again. So we were mislabeling deaths from other causes as COVID deaths at that time. But on top of that, we have a relatively fragile healthcare system. We had Hancock, who was quite passionate about sorting out deaths at the weekends in the NHS, because the death rate was considerably higher at the weekends when there were fewer staff around. If you take a fragile healthcare system, send a load of staff home, what do you think is going to happen? And also add in the fear, add in the PPE, add in the do not resuscitate orders, try and keep ICU clear in case your colleagues are going to be in there. All of that has a very detrimental impact. And we know that there were non-COVID excess deaths in spring 2020. But the question is, well, how many of the COVID deaths actually might not have happened if there hadn't been all of the panic and the difficulty with providing care that we had, when you haven't got a staffed ambulance system or staffed A&E. And also when people are scared and they're behaving differently and they're not asking for help in the same way, that has a huge impact. Now, we didn't have that with Omicron. That was the big difference with Omicron, is that people stayed calm and let everyone just get on with it. And we didn't see the deaths that came with it. And we have South Africa to thank for that, because they stayed calm and then they didn't have many deaths. And then people were like, oh, okay, this one's different. And so we'll stay calm for it.
Well, I think you said a lot there, but on that point, is it not the case that that's because many people thought, well, the vaccination has protected people? And if you haven't been vaccinated and you've caught it, which many people have done as well, then you have some immunity towards it. But that was what was different, wasn't it, with Omicron? That was the thing that most people were saying.
Yeah. So that would have calmed nerves as well. I'm just a little bit cynical that that's the whole story. So, there was a time with the data where you could make a strong case around deaths being prevented with Delta and with earlier on. But if you look at the data, it's always tricky, isn't it, with statistics, because you can almost always look at things at a different angle and come up with a different story. So you always just have to be a bit careful that you're actually trying to get to the truth. And what we found with all of the evidence on vaccination is that any attempt to make the vaccine look better they do. They'll adjust for this and adjust for that and make it look better. But what you never see is any adjustments the other direction. There should be adjustments in the other direction. So when you're looking at who's infected, for example, we know that vaccinated people are getting tested more. So they're more likely, that makes a difference. And so they'll adjust for that because that makes the vaccine look better. But we also know that people who are of minority ethnic groups or poorer socioeconomic profiles, they are more likely to die with it. So when you're trying to do a measurement of death, you need to account for that because they're also more likely to be unvaccinated. And that's never, ever accounted for, which, it just feels really wrong to me. But so what I've tried to do to try and understand that data better is to look at the deaths per person hospitalised. Because there should be a difference there between vaccinated and unvaccinated, but it's really hard to see a difference. And actually that deaths per person hospitalised didn't really change between Omicron and the previous ones. So either the difference is in the lead up to getting into hospital, or else some of what we've been told is just not quite true.
Well, and also the recording of it and the 28 days of testing with it. And there's a danger with all of this just to become cavalier and cynical about everything, right? Oh, none of it means anything, or you can never trust anything, and that's dangerous as well, right? We've got to be able to interrogate, investigate, draw conclusions and make decisions and policy, right? Because there is a sense, I think, where people are weary and they're just like, everyone just makes things up all the time. Other vaccinations now with younger people and children, partly as a consequence of access, but partly I think also as a consequence of concerns. They've gone down somewhat, things that there's a long history of efficacy of them, regardless of what anyone thinks about this one. And also just the general trust deficit isn't the positive transform, not the sense we can do something to transform things, just like, everything everyone always tells us is just surely we need to be able to convert things into something positive where we can take action and insist that things are done better, rather than a cynical kind of, it's all part of this thing that's never going to be honest, right? It's kind of like slightly defeatist in the sense that we're not going to get anything better.
Yes, and you'd think that given where we've come to with lack of trust, that would be the key focus now for public health, is how on earth do we regain trust because we've broken this. And, for people in public health as a career, apart from the epidemiologists, apart from the modelers, this vaccination was their whole life, right? This is what they do for public health, is they vaccinate children and vaccinate vulnerable people. And they are about to lose trust over that. And you'd think that they would be really desperate to try and make sure that system doesn't break. And they, you can see that they are concerned, right? They definitely have found that as a concern, but they haven't addressed it except to say, go and get jabbed, get your children jabbed, it's important to get them jabbed. They're still not actually talking to people like they are people. They're not sort of saying, look, actually, okay, maybe we shouldn't have pushed the COVID jabs the way we did. Maybe a little bit of a confession around some of the nudging and manipulation and an apology would go an enormous way to regaining trust about things that really do matter. And to say to people, look, we've made this, that, and the other mistake, which we regret because we don't want it to cause additional harm with people losing faith in other policies that are really important.
I want to come on in a second to what's going to happen the autumn, winter. We've already seen that there's over 6.5 million people waiting on waiting lists. We've got all sorts of issues with cancer, heart disease, stroke, sepsis, from dentistry to everything. There's all sorts of issues. And if the last 15 years are anything to go by, this autumn and winter, as you say, seasonal thing is going to be significant. How we handle and tackle that and what our approach should be and how we get ready for it. But I've got to ask, because some people are just convinced there's a reason for all of this beyond this. When you look at this, you're very much in the stats and the evidence and looking at that, drawing that. My approach has been, well, I've got a view that I think there's a combination of things. We've seen a lot of these things, like nudge. We've seen it for the last 15 years. A lot of people weren't looking, right? So they didn't really notice it till COVID. Similarly, the contempt of the public and treating them with disdain, and when in doubt, regulate, and imposing policy, right? And treating the public as though they're almost infectious all the time with antisocial behaviour and disease and all that. But if you just start looking at things in the middle of COVID, right, or if you have a view before, some people have had a view before, obviously, about some of these things, but it can just look like this is impossible. This can all be happening like this. And there's a very particular, distinct plan and reason why this is happening. I mean, when you reflect on these things, where do you orientate yourself on this?
So depends on my mood. And Nick Hudson put this quite well. So where he says he gets asked, how much of this was incompetence, how much of it was deliberate intent, and how much of it was a murmuration, like, everybody was just copying each other. And his answer to that is just, yes, it's all of those. And, I think that's sort of the easiest answer really is there are elements of all of that. There's absolutely incompetence, really horrific incompetence that's involved. And there has to be incompetence because you've got all sorts of middle people who, can't possibly be under any other external influences, who haven't stood up, haven't spoken out, haven't stopped things going wrong. And the murmuration aspect is absolutely there. We've seen how leaders have copied other leaders. So, some things seem to happen all at once in a kind of quite frightening lockstep. But other times there's definitely a domino effect going on. And then the idea that it is planned, I think sometimes some of the things can look planned when they weren't necessarily. So people have sort of produced patents that have got early dates on, or purchases for PCR tests that have earlier dates on. And sometimes there do seem to be valid reasons for that having happened, where that thing existed and then they've changed the name on it retrospectively, and it makes it look like it was always that name when it wasn't. As I say, it does depend on my mood, because sometimes when you're looking at the enormity of it all, it's as a human who wants a simple way of understanding the world, it's easy to grasp onto that and to use that as a way of just sort of settling your mind to say, well, now that makes sense. But the reality is that the world is really complex, and as I said right from the beginning, none of us understand everything, and trying to make everything into one simple explanation isn't actually very grown up.
Well, I think it's a really important point, because my personal take on it is that since the Cold War, since the end of the Cold War, and really since the end of the 80s, early 90s, that the idea there's no alternative, no different ideas in politics, we've seen an increase, except pretty much in a couple of places like China and North Korea. We've seen an increase in a kind of the samification. So if you think about the Blair Cameron-ish type moment, and you look at that internationally, you've got a kind of technocratic, bureaucratic elite that isn't so much about big ideas or principles that, like, basically, Labour represents Labour, right? Well, not really anymore. No. Or conservatives are conservative, not so much, right? And those old ideas that really divided society, the 20th century, that were really about either you want to conserve what is or you want to transform it in a radical way, that all went away. And then what happens, it seems to me, is that the public are often seen in a dubious way, treated like, they're a bit like mad, bad and dangerous, and they need to be regulated. And that was kind of agreed by many international organizations, and this kind of all the great and the good, the smart people will do all these things, and then they'll just... And therefore, when it comes to NGOs or international governments and policy, people end up doing very similar things, like you say, right? Because there's pretty much a muchness. Now, there are some outliers and some slightly different things. But to me, that seems to be what the issue is. But it really, what I often say as well is, well, regardless of why you think it is, it seems that like on all these issues, the question is, where are the public within it all, right? Can the public have a voice and a say? And it doesn't mean that they have to be a virologist or an epidemic, but what is, how does policy play out? What are the, who's being held responsible and accountable from, elected representatives? why, when you say certain things, can you be taken down from social media? Why is the government then going to put more measures like that with the online safety bill or the police bill with protests? You know, what the public can say and all that, and the public can demand what it wants to see with science and with policy and with everything. And in a way, that's the best antidote to all of it, whatever you think why the reason is, because no matter who it is, if we've got a strong public and they're putting everyone under pressure, no matter what they say at the WHO or the EU or anything, right? Vaccine passports is a really good example. If we just say we're not going to have them in any shape here in Britain, no matter what happens, it doesn't really matter what's said elsewhere by anyone or what they're, you know, if there are a few people trying to do some things, there's always some interest because we've got a strong public that's active and engaged and pushing people. I mean, that seems to me to be a way for most people to have an impact, surely.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a real problem with representation of the public. You know, we have career politicians who do not come from the areas they're meant to be representing and who do not have the same experience of life as the people they're meant to be representing. And that's problem that's been going on for so long that means voices aren't heard. Voices are not heard. And the fact we've got a mainstream media that is so captured by politics and so one-dimensional as well. You know, there's no range of voices in that mainstream media. Is a really big problem, and I'm not sure exactly how we address it. But obviously, the world we live in means that there are ways to be heard, and that people are heard outside of that. And I think we need to get the public feeling that they can have a voice within that realm. And at the moment, that realm is quite messy, and you know, we don't have. People don't know which voices to amplify and which ones are sort of verifiable. In a way that with the media, that was the role they played, really, wasn't it? It was to take a story and actually verify it before amplifying it. But they failed so catastrophically in that we almost have to rely on the messy version for now until we can get something that's going to work better. And yeah, I mean, I think the public do need to be heard and need to be respected, because I don't think the public are out there saying we know what's best, right? That's not the thing here. It's not that they're ready to counter what scientific advice was said to the government. It's more around being heard with what their concerns are, with what the impact was, with what, you know, with where things have gone wrong. If you're not listening, if you're actually actively shutting down, so that you have broken your system for correcting your mistakes, and you were going to end up making worse mistakes. And you know, the whole foundation of our society is to have systems to correct mistakes, which is why we don't go and make all the mistakes that communist countries make of buying all their tractors or causing starvation across the country. And we've broken those systems in a you know, without a second thought, because of these people who seem to think they're omniscient. It's embarrassing.
So we haven't got an inquiry properly until 2026 probably, and it's a year delayed, it looks like already. And in this coming up to the autumn and the winter, how do you see some of the issues that we're faced with, causes for optimism and also concern? And perhaps we'd see some contributions to an inquiry from the point of view of the NHS and health and all of that from you guys, I'm not sure. But tell us a bit about how you see this next period and what you're concerned about, what you hope might happen and what you think could happen and what we can do about all of that.
So the Scottish are doing their inquiry. So yeah, it's worth keeping an eye on that because that's ongoing. And it's interesting that it's only after they're started that this the English one got pushed back massively. So I think we do have a disaster at the moment in the NHS. So we're in summer and we have more beds occupied than we had capacity for beds during the kind of winter of 2020-21. So do you remember all of those headlines around how it was a broken, you know, we haven't got any room, you all got to stay at home, otherwise it's a disaster. Well, we're having more of a disaster now than we had then, but the disaster now is not because of COVID. It's because of non-COVID problems. And people, therefore, don't want to talk about it because those are problems, no doubt, caused by policy one way or another.
Can I just ask, on those ones, how much of them are still as a consequence of bed separations and some restrictions that still exist, or is it back now to normal capacity as it was before?
So I don't know for certain, but just from the data, the fact that we have this enormous capacity that we didn't have last winter, and so the winter before, means that they cannot still be having like half empty wards. You know, we have suddenly found all of this bed capacity because there are suddenly patients filling all of these beds with non-COVID problems. And so if we're heading into winter with an NHS that is already in that situation, it's going to be a mess, because we have an NHS that has worked for decades on the business model of, well, we're not going to, spend extra for winter respiratory diseases. We will just cancel all the operations. And that's what we've done for, well over a decade. Every winter, the operations get cancelled. It's just, that is the business model. But now we're in a situation where we're almost in that problem. We're having that problem in the summertime as we're about to head into winter. Now, what happens this winter, I can't tell fortunes, but there are I'll give you the two extremes. On the one extreme, in 1889, we had what we thought was a coronavirus pandemic, and there were excess deaths that you can see in the measures that lasted for 3 years. And we don't really know what happened after that, but it was a sort of a 3-year problem. So, maybe we're coming towards the end of it, and maybe when you look at the data on the antibodies and how many children have had it, and then, it does look like it's mostly worked its way through, so we might not be seeing the same problems as we saw before. But there will be a respiratory virus this winter, whatever we do. The other end of the extreme is to say, well, the way that respiratory viruses work is you have a good winter, a bad winter, and a good winter, and a bad winter, because when you have a bad winter, people die, and the following winter they're not around anymore to die, and so then by the winter after that you've built up more vulnerable, and then you lose people again. So we might be heading for a bad winter in terms of mortality, because we've had a period of building up vulnerable people in the community. So we've got a bad winter potentially on an NHS that's already broken, and so then the question is, how do you handle that? And the preparation needs to be being done now to get us ready for that. And the preparation needs to entail being a bit cleverer about how we're testing. Not sending home healthy healthcare workers just because they've got a positive test when you're in a hospital full of virus, because you've got infected people churning it out the whole time. So, you sort out the ventilation the best you can. You don't send home your healthy staff, because that causes huge issues, losing healthy staff.
There's a question about whether you have staff actually stay. You can come up with creative solutions, right? Maybe you have some staff that stay a little closer to the hospitals and all that. We built all these nightingales, and then they were left pretty much empty for so long. I mean, you think about innovation and resourcefulness and having a dynamic, engaged response to things, right? Yeah. And it's just kind of seems to be lacking that sense of agility and...
Yeah, and there's also the issue of how in the past... autumn comes along, COVID comes back, and staff get pulled from the front line to go and jab people. We can't be doing that. That just doesn't make sense, to lose the staff that are actually treating the actual sick who need to have their deaths prevented, and sticking them in a clinic, especially when a lot of these clinics are going to be pretty empty because people aren't voting with their feet anymore on that. Then we need to talk properly about treatment. So the sort of story that there was no early treatment is just a ludicrous story. Of course there's treatment, because you treat, we have treatments that deal with inflammation, we have treatments that deal with respiratory problems. Of course there was always treatment, but people were told there's nothing we can do, you have to stay home until you're blue and then call 999, which isn't very good for their psychology or their recovery.
Just quickly, what kind of treatments?
Well, just very simple things. So we had great evidence that the brown inhaler that asthmatics use, that is a very safe, benign way of reducing the hospitalisation rate dramatically. So when you used it in people who were, I think it was 50-year-olds and under, the hospitalisation rate reduced by 90%. I mean, it was massive. And that's a very simple intervention to say, right, if you've got COVID, take some of this brown inhaler. And it became the NHS, in fact, this was an Oxford study that showed it. The NHS got it onto their guidelines. And then there's never an explanation given, but it got taken off. So that not just taken off as in we don't recommend it anymore, taken off in such a way that GPs were unable to give this to their patients anymore. It's just bizarre. I've never understood the story behind that. But, we also have treatments that the evidence is very, very good that they're safe. Very, very good that they're safe. And if you're talking about somebody who is at risk of dying and a treatment that is safe, you then don't need really strong evidence about how good it is. Do you see what I mean? There's always a balance. But we have really good evidence that they're good as well. So ivermectin, there is a very strong body of evidence that works. And the fact that it has doctors that have tried to tell the story of ivermectin and it'll come out and innocently, like me, naively thinking, I'll just tell them this and then everything's going to get better. And then they get attacked and taken down, have their registrations attacked. And then the people who write the papers have them attacked. People have, the way that it's been sort of actively suppressed just rings huge alarm bells for me that this is probably something that actually could have made an enormous difference, because there's no reason to go hammer and tongs suppressing a safe drug that's not really achieving anything. There's no reason to, right? Because it would just not really achieve anything, and that would be fine. There would be no bad outcome for anyone if that was the case. And yet we've seen the massive suppression. And so, I think we need some openness that actually we do have treatments that could work really well. And that, the pharma companies have come up with their own more recently, but they are always sort of going for one particular aspect of the problem. The thing about ivermectin that's really beautiful is that it actually addresses the problem from multiple different angles. Which with viruses is always a good thing to do, which is why with things like HIV, you don't treat with one drug, you treat with multiple drugs. So you're trying to attack it from different angles.
I wish we had more time, but the point about openness and debate and discussion and not having people pulled down and taken down, and in the spirit of that, we want to do much more of that. Thank you so much for coming in to Together Talks podcast, Claire. It's been really good talking with you. Good luck over the next period. We're looking forward to hearing more from you in the press and seeing you and HART and everyone. Dr. Clare Craig, this is Together Talks podcast. I'm Alan Miller. We'd love you to join as a member as well. That's the way we can keep having our voices heard together. And in the spirit of today, as you've seen, we'd love the public to get involved much more in these debates and discussions. Join me next time at Together Talks podcast. Thank you.